He's back, people. We got Hermsmeyer. The Eagle has landed. He's back on the podcast. Josh Hermsmeyer, how are you, my friend?
Doing good, doing good. I'm glad to be here to talk post-draft GM stuff. And yeah, man, I love this pod. I listen all the time.
Well, we appreciate that. I mean the royal we. I'm throwing in there because it's just me back here putting together the widgets here for this pod. And we got to talk post draft. Okay, so I would say, we are probably in agreement like 90% of the time. We have maybe 10% disagreement. We had a little bit of a disagreement earlier this year when I was a bit more optimistic, you might say, in what would happen forward looking with new, younger GMs coming into the league. And maybe they're starting to get a critical mass of that it would become not table stakes, but getting close to table stakes to at least follow certain principles going forward. Now, the relative edge would be you have to kind of keep up with the crowd versus just totally eschewing that sort of thinking and just going by the results. Now, I would say I probably got a little bit more negative as I've seen things going on in the offseason, a lot of ways that things were being framed. The draft, I think, was good and bad in some of that as far as it's concerned. So I need to check in with you. Take your temperature now, since I'm maybe around the same place as I was before. What is your thought on what you're seeing now in the NFL? Hopeful, optimistic, pessimistic? What's going on with you?
So I only think there's one sharp GM in the league, and
one of 32.
One of 32, and that's the one that lives in Philly. And even then, I think that there's plenty of room for Howie to be a little less smug, a little less confident, and be better. But he is far and away the one that if you were going to say you have to bet on a GM doing something smart, or at least the bog standard table stakes level you mentioned, it would be Howie. The rest are all pretty much tied for me.
Okay, so that's similar to what you had said last time. Now, do you think, and this is something that I've thought about when I was going through and trying to grade in a quantitative manner, but then also with some qualitative, subjective stuff in there, what happened during the draft, that is it a function of the fact, at least in my opinion, it's like not messing up is almost job one. It's like the Hippocratic Oath sort of thing. Do no harm is almost job one for GM. So it's a little bit harder to point out definitively something sharp that someone has done as opposed to something poor or something kind of a little bit on more of the donkey side, if we have that divide, sharp versus donkey side for these different GMs. And then because you're just constantly seeing these different poor value moves, you start to get this impression that everyone is bad. But the reality is it's just more difficult to pinpoint them doing the right thing because we think it's kind of easy and kind of what you should be able to do without any problems.
Well, I mean, I think there's a fairly simple heuristic, and that's that we don't need to really get into the whys, but we can just look at what they actually do or don't do. And most do bad things and don't do sharp things. And I'm not talking about things that are even like small edges, or I'm not making too fine a point about these things. I'm saying the base rate stuff, positional value stuff, not passing over QBs when you definitely have a need. I mean, these are just simple things that I think that anytime you make excuses for GMs who are not doing these very simple things, you're doing a disservice to the entire idea of what we're trying to make an argument for, which is use the best evidence you can to make the best decisions possible. And so I think in that vein, saying that's the heuristic for understanding who's sharp and who's not, and that's the way I grade them. It's also interesting to try and understand why, right? Because I mean, once you get to the structural level of this thing, you can maybe see why things keep happening. And I think one of the best ways, like my Rosetta Stone right now, for how to understand GMs and how they make the decisions they make, why they make the decisions they make, and how they behave, is this article in The Athletic recently by Randy Mueller. He's a former GM, and he's currently, I believe, the director of player personnel for the XFLC Dragons. But he writes this article, and he basically goes through what he would have done in the draft, or at least talks about his experience being a GM and the way he made decisions and what he would have done in certain instances. And I want to go through some of his points, and I want to use them as a springboard to kind of talk about why I believe this really is the best way to understand how GMs do their job, or at least the current crop.
Okay, we can get it to you. I believe it's Mueller, but I'm not sure. Maybe I'm just
Mueller.
going off of our former FBI director. And he
But
hosts.
even,
I know
even that, people called them Mueller too. So
is it Mueller? Maybe it is Mueller. Actually,
So
if I,
I'm saying,
okay, sorry,
I don't know.
not politically connected here, buddy. But I know that he writes periodically for The Athletic, and I believe he co-hosts a show with Mike Sando where they feed it into the Athletic feed, where it's the football GM, I think they call it, being a former player personnel guy. But this is the guy that we're talking about here, and he wrote an article after the draft talking about a few different things. So go ahead. I think there was a lot revealing within that article as not only to what his thinking may be, but a broader frame for how his style of GM is looking at these things.
Correct. Yeah. So he writes, I always struggled and was sometimes angered when a scout, coach, or both gave an opinion on a player that hurt the cause of consensus. Now, I truly believe this describes almost every GM in the league, right? Like NFL GMs, they make mouth noises about aggregating opinions in their building, right? Especially like maybe Les Snead, for instance, someone who is the subject of a media think piece, right? And they'll brag about their superior information, but in the end, they undo whatever that edge is, whatever that informational edge is, and what it gives them by being completely unable. And I think it's an emotional thing. They're emotionally unable to deal with someone who doesn't fall in line with them. And that dissenter, interestingly, is the exact voice you need to be awaiting in your analysis to get sharper, right? And the evidence that this is true is out there. There's like public mocks, like what Arif Hassan does used to be at The Athletic. Now he's on his own over at the Draft Network or somewhere like that. I can't remember where he is now.
I believe so.
And
Pro Football Network.
That's it. Yeah. That's it. But he's been doing this consensus big board for years, and people have done a lot of analysis based on it. And the public is about as good at slotting players according to talent as the NFL. And if teams were properly leveraging their superior information, they'd be better than these outsiders, right? But the real power of that aggregation of these diverse opinions, it closes the gap and it eliminates that edge. So you can have a situation
on that point, because I think that's a really interesting point, the consensus thing, unless you're still going on about
it. No, that's it. That's my first point. So go ahead.
Okay. So with the consensus thing, I think that's really interesting because I've heard a few times since then, and I believe when he was talking about consensus here, he was referring, or he had another piece that was referring specifically to the Anthony Richardson pick by the Colts. Because his thought was, with Richardson's profile, only having a year as a starter, a pretty low completion percentage, there were some, warts, if you want to say that. I know even there was a post-draft piece written by Stephen Holder over at ESPN who covers the Colts, and it mentioned that Ed Dodds, who is like the second in command to Chris Ballard, who's been shortlisted for GM jobs going forward, he had something to the quote to the effect of like, what are we doing here? Even looking at Richardson, just having a periphery, a superficial glance at like his type of profile. So I was surprised because I'd read it a few different places where they talk about consensus for this type of pick, this type of big quarterback early pick. You need to have the owner on board, you need to have the GM on board, and you want to have consensus everywhere. And I think it makes sense from a like avoiding regret sort of perspective. And that's my big thing in the NFL. These guys are all trying to avoid regretting something, because if you don't have anyone in the building who can definitively say, I was against this, then when it goes wrong, if you were all for it, you're all going down in the ship together, that type of situation. But for me, like, I don't think you actually need consensus on these things.
That's not avoiding regret. That's socializing failure.
Socializing failure. Well, you know what I mean, like avoiding conflict in the future based upon this sort of thing. But for me, like, I'm all about what makes the best pick, and the best pick can have consensus absent, right? Like, do you want a bunch of opinions that are in one direction, but maybe of different lukewarm degrees? Or if there are strong opinions in either direction and then you still make the pick, sometimes that could end up in a range of outcomes type of aspect as being the best pick. So I guess I'm maybe anti this idea that consensus even should be the goal in this circumstance, because do we know it actually leads to the best decisions?
Right. I mean, weighted consensus is the answer, and that's what a model does. So now a model isn't the end of the story, and the inputs are human inputs, the best ones that I think. But at the end of the day, because you can't just do it with production, you need to use these scouting grades, and then once you've tiered these guys, right, then you're really in this nebulous world of we don't know, and then the best GMs will be the ones that are humble about not knowing. And then they will treat these picks as bets and not as something that's attached to their ego. And I'll get into that some more with this article. So this is actually dovetails right into what Mueller talks about, or Mueller talks about being an evaluator. He says, and I think this pinpoints the reason why this current class of NFL GMs will never get better at this, really. He says, I never wanted to side with the loudest or highest ranking voice in the room. Fortunately, I'm an experienced evaluator myself and have high confidence from many years of doing it. So I had my own thoughts to fall back on. And he adds in this parenthetical here, which will drive some people crazy, but I don't want to focus on the wrong thing. He says, some GMs who are salary capped experts and not evaluators could possibly side with the best salesperson in the room. Not him, though. So almost every GM in their heart of hearts, right, they view themselves as the top scout. Right? That's why they go to pro days. I mean, that's why they go to the Senior Bowl and patrol the sidelines like some feudal lord, surveying their vassals or whatever. So I think that this is absolutely pinpoints the problem. And I think we can look at what happens in the league. And a great example is what happened with the Lions and GM Brad Holmes. So there's this article that was written about his analysis of Jahmyr Gibbs and why they came to take him with the 12th overall pick. And I'll quote from this article. It says, in Gibbs, the Lions had another guy that Holmes had long eyed. The GM live scouted him at Alabama, Texas in September. When he arrived there to evaluate Bryce Young, Bijan Robinson, and Anderson, he got a tip. Watch the transfer back from Georgia Tech. He was impressed. When he was on the field level, this is important, with how Gibbs was built and how he moved. In time, he'd come to look at Gibbs as more of a weapon than a back, one who'd fit in his running back room as presently constituted better than Robinson would. So let's put aside the whole, let's put aside positional value. I don't know how I can. It seems insane. We're going to put that aside for a second. But back to consensus. Here's Holmes, who went on the field one time for one game, one where I've heard from some scouts who say that was one of like Robinson's worst games. So for one game, he was on the field level, saw how this guy moved, and was able to buck all consensus about who the best back in the draft was. Okay. That is what being a top scout is. It's how they define themselves. They don't define themselves as managers or creators or something larger, an organization. They're scouts.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting because you could say that comment about a former salary cap expert, I mean, it's not directed, obviously, because everyone is really heaping praise upon someone like Howie Roseman. But, Howie Roseman, I think he spent some time in some of the scouting areas, but obviously that wasn't his traditional purview there. So I guess my question would be, and I think this is part of the problem, this is part of the issue when in this Ballard piece, and I've seen it a billion times before, where they say, and it came also in Carolina for Fritterer, they're talking about that the top decision maker doesn't want to reveal his opinions or his explicit opinions on who he believes is the top pick. And, magically, everyone has a consensus opinion that falls exactly in line with what that happened to be when it's finally revealed. So my question is, the model now, which is Super Scout becomes GM, whoever's the best scout becomes GM. Is there any way to avoid that? Isn't it? Because if you have Super Scout becomes GM, then if you're a scout below the Super Scout and you have a differing opinion than the Super Scout, doesn't that put you in a position of essentially being wrong in some sort of way, shape, or form? And you're not going to want to air that opinion or have that opinion in the current model as it's stated. Is there any way to avoid that?
No, not in the current model. And because it truly makes them angry, because it is about how they define themselves. They're the top scout. Their opinion, if it's disagreed with by enough people below them, it becomes offensive to them. And there's no way to hide that. Because again, it's definitional. It's why they got the job. I am top scout, and you are telling me I'm wrong. Who the fuck are you? So of course that's going to trickle down emotionally, emotively, the way that you lead these people. It's going to make its way into their analysis and the way they present their information, the way that they bang or not bang the table for certain players, the way they suck up to their boss. So I think one of the interesting things is, how do we get this to change? I don't think we do. I think that someone who's actually so I'll give an example, and then I'll talk about. So like, people lionize Steve Jobs, right? And I think it's mostly horseshit. I think he was a sociopath, but he did say something that I think was pretty
He had a good
profoundly.
aesthetic, though. He had an aesthetic thing going on.
Yeah, but he also thought about things deeply, and this is one of the examples of it. And he says, some journalists asked him what his favorite product was, right? He's like, of all the ones you've helped bring into the world, and he's like, Apple, not iTunes, not iPod, not iPhone. He was most interested in creating an organization. He saw that as his life's work. And the closest thing we've had to that kind of Jobsian obsession with every aspect of how a team is built is Bill Walsh. And he was, of course, also wildly successful. But there are no Bill Walshes in the league right now. There are only super scouts.
But what about Bill Belichick? Does he qualify as a Walshian figure?
I mean, I think we've seen more and more, and I've had this take before. I wrote an article on 538 about it, that while he is a great coach, there's no doubt about that, I don't think he was on the level of Walsh. Walsh created trees. He had coaching trees. He had a system. Anytime someone leaves one Patriot way, they fall apart spectacularly. There's nothing there. There's no there. In fact, I would argue Bill Belichick is very, very good at his job, but that he benefited more than anyone wants to admit from having Tom Brady. And that's not an original take, but I think we need to underline it. The real success that you find in NFL, the lasting success that the 49ers had, was that they had a incredibly obsessively detailed system under Bill Walsh. He wrote a damn book about how detailed he was. I mean, he was micromanaging his secretary. Like, it's wild. So
yeah, he doesn't exactly seem like a dude that would be a lot of fun to work with, though. Either, I have to say.
No.
No walk in the park dealing with that
sociopaths.
guy.
Like, I'm not saying this is the model for how to do things, but I am saying it's the model, but I'm not saying that they're the type of person that comes along with being that type of organization freak and detail-oriented person and desire to own every aspect of the enterprise. I think that you almost necessarily select for sociopaths, but I don't think it has to be that way. How does that?
I said, the one thing I'll say in that regard is that, and this is like, I think that has to come, though, from a coach. This is why I mentioned Belichick, like a coach kind of taking over the organization as opposed to a GM taking over the organization. I mean, the coach is really more of the authority figure in like 99% of the time. I mean, another example would probably be like Bill Parcells or someone like that. Really just comes in, like no one could come in like and have that sort of authority, that sort of free reign to go ahead and remake an organization in the way that he wanted to. Would you agree with that a coach kind of has to be the person in that regard?
I guess. I mean, if you look at Bill Walsh's history, it wasn't like he had some kind of moral authority like the tuna, like Bill Belichick. He was kind of passed over. He was like a third choice for the Niners, if I recall correctly, out of Stanford. It wasn't like he came in with some amazing. And the other thing is that Paul Brown didn't even vouch for him at certain points in his career. Like, he really felt like he was done dirty. And so when he came in, he felt like he needed to overdo everything. He needed to over prepare. He felt like that he didn't belong. And so he was just always trying to keep up and stay ahead. And I think that is an outsider's perspective more than this insider's perspective you seem to be describing. But I do agree that it would probably be easier for someone like Tuna, if he came in with these ideas, to implement them.
Yeah. Well, one more thing on the Super Scout thing is that it just seems like a bad use of time for the GM to be scouting, really concerned with scouting, as opposed to doing everything possible to try to figure out how to use all the information at his, I guess, or her someday, disposal to figure out how to make the best decision. Because ultimately, that's what they're responsible for, right? Like they have other people who can do the scouting. No one can actually make the decision other than the GM. But one other thing that I'll mention, and this maybe goes back to the larger theme of whether or not people can do things correctly. How much do we need to give passes to, of course, you're not in the pass giving business, but maybe I am a little bit more than you. How much do we need to give passes to GMs knowing that they have a short-term thinking, a lot of the times irrational, reactive ownership in a lot of different circumstances, and they have to really, their only means of staying in the job that they have is satisfying that beast, the ownership beast. Otherwise, they don't really have any means of some sort of objective standard for why they should stay in the job, other than the fact that the ownership wants them to be there.
How is that different from any other GM?
No, it's not different from any other job. I'm just saying GMs generally. How do we think about it? How do we think
I
about
guess
that,
what I'm saying is you took the fucking job. Like you're the GM now. You took the job. You took the job. So you get the blame and you get the credit. And so much of what we see happen in these organizations, in these buildings, is the privatization of wins and the socialization of losses. And that is literally what the sharp ones, right? I call them, I derisively call the Cleveland consultants. Like, you know, they know exactly where the line is and how far you can push things until you actually have to take ownership of something that might come back and bite your career. And they will not push that line. And I think it's cowardly. And so I think Mueller, he has a really insightful kind of take on this.
We have to pick one. We got to just pick one on his. So we don't
what
go.
Do you mean?
So we don't say. Let's just go with Mueller. Go ahead.
Mueller. Yeah. Okay. So he says, I, for one, could not have chosen the direction the Colts went. Right. I'm not saying they're wrong, just couldn't have done it. It's one thing to have a diverse set of opinions. But then he gets down to why that is. And he says, I had knots in my stomach for the powers that be in Indy. And that's because without consensus, you can't socialize failure, right? It's on you. And the Texans are a good example of this. They're one example. Nick Caesarea was frog marched into taking a QB that there was no consensus on. And to compensate, they traded a freaking gaggle of picks to move up to take an edge guy that because he's the top scout, that's the guy he wanted, right? And I think you see it in Minnesota. I think you see their team that just good enough to lose with Kirk Cousins, that the GM continues to avoid making bold decisions, draft potential replacement. Analytic types like you keep making ridiculous excuses for it.
Hey,
he's the GM. He's the GM because they want to believe he represents us somehow, and he doesn't. He's only interested in maximizing the length of his tenure as GM, not maximizing the chances of the Vikings winning the Super Bowl. You get no points.
That's interesting.
You get actually 0 points.
I'm actually writing up a post here currently on like the principal agent problem, which is what they call it. When you have, normally it's in the context of a business, like a CEO trying to maximize their own worth vis-a-vis the ownership of this group. Now, I do think it's a little bit different in the NFL, and I would maybe substitute the principle in the NFL instead of being the ownership, because I do think the ownership gets really caught up in like the day-to-day as being more like the fans who are really the somewhat also like long-term asset holders. Like their fandom is really attached to this team.
Stakeholders, at least.
Stakeholders, right. So for a very long period of time. And yeah, I do think Minnesota, it was interesting. I was on a podcast with Matthew Collier, who is he does Purple Insider. He has a Substack. He's Substack brother in arms.
He's got a new book out, by the way. Fantastic.
Yeah, new book on PFF. I haven't read it yet, but I will. And he was talking about like what the Vikings should do. And it's one of those things where last season you could say, okay, I kind of get it. Like you stick with Kirk for a year and then you figure it out and then this, that. But now we're at this season and man, it's hard. Like they are really in a bad spot. Like way worse than
came out before last season and badmouthed him. Like, I mean, there was
badmouth. I mean, he said he's not Patrick Mahomes.
It was a shocking
decision.
It was a shocking decision because there was no winning for him there. It was almost like he just wanted to signal to the nerds that he gets it, but he doesn't get it because he's not doing it.
But like every year that passes, I think for a GM, it becomes more and more of this principal agent problem. And I think this is also part of what we saw in two relatively new young GMs in Detroit and in Atlanta is that they're both entering their third season. So to start over at quarterback, to not do what will maximize 2023 wins, when Detroit is the leader, at least odds-wise, to win the division, Atlanta is a pretty close second to the Saints to win a wide-open division. I think it becomes a real big problem there if you bring in a new GM and you do not allow them just to blow things up in year one, because then the number of GMs and coaches who survive 3 years of not making the playoffs or not having a winning record is almost nil.
I mean, it's a very strange kind of contortion. Logically, you have to put yourself in a pretzel to say, now that we're at year 3 and we made all these bad decisions, we're really stuck. Like, yeah, well, you made bad decisions that got you there. You should have immediately started making these decisions that gave you more outs. That's the entire point here. But you start stacking bad decisions on bad decisions, and then you say, oh, well, now I'm stuck, guys. You have to see, all my paths have been closed off.
Okay. You got another dose of negativity in the quotes over there?
I do. So this is just kind of my summation of the whole thing. I think when you think about NFL GMs, it's this unholy brew of ego, fear, and failure, and an overconfidence in what's an extremely noisy evaluation process. And that defines what it is to be a modern GM. And all those forces make them cowardly, because in their hearts, they know that their advancement was mostly due to luck. And when you probably can't do the same magic trick twice without the audience figuring it out, you do anything you can to avoid situations where your reputation's on the line. And that's what we see over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, and there are very few second acts for GMs who don't have something to pin their success on the first time. I mean, there's very few second acts, period, for GMs, less so than even for coaches. So yeah, if you've ascended to that spot and that's really no place else to go other than be GM, to lose that job, that kind of relegates you to always being a second tier sort of person who's, it's not great reputationally, right? When you have these guys who were once GM and then they go to work someplace else, it's almost like a joke in a way for certain guys, like Grigson or someone used to be the GM of the Colts, is he in Minnesota? I don't remember where he's been. He's bounced around a couple different places. He was in Cleveland and then he's someplace else. John Dorsey, who's now behind, and Brad Holmes. It's kind of like, I don't know if anyone really sees these guys as being positive, because by their very nature, that you have to fail on your way out there. So trying to avoid that is a very powerful disincentive to maybe do the right thing in the long term.
But if you don't let your ass clinch up and you actually make these bets, right, that have great payoff if they hit, and you realize that luck is not on your side, or could be on your side or not, it really doesn't, it depends, but luck is the first order term here, that you need to get lucky first. So you might as well make these bets that if they pay off, they do set you up to actually have a longer career, right? Because the payoff's so high. It's instead you look at the negative side, right? And you look at trying to socialize away failure, and you look at trying to mitigate instead of trying to be bold. And it just never works. I mean, at the end, you have to get seriously lucky. You have to luck box into a Tom Brady, right? Look at what happened to Ballard. He thought he was going into a great situation with Andrew Luck. Nope. Look at what happened to Cesario. Thought he was going into probably a decent situation with Watson. Nope. And so, like, there's so much you can't control. So why don't you do the sharp thing, the smart thing that everyone knows is smart, right? When the things you can control.
Okay, how about this for some evidence that things may be improving on the margins when we talk about some of this stuff? And I'm going to go to positional value here. And this could be more of a reflection of this particular draft class. But if you look at, let's just take the first round of the NFL draft that just happened. We, of course, big focus on the Bijan Robinson pick at number 8, the Jahmyr Gibbs pick at number 12, the Lions again taking off-ball linebacker Jack Campbell at number 18, maybe some reaches that had happened in there. But overall, outside of those 3 picks, And maybe if you want to throw in tight end, Dalton Kincaid, depending upon how you view tight ends in the positional value equation. I'm not sure if tight ends are like a bad positional value or they just have been bad in the first round. They're just difficult to rank order. Outside of that, it wasn't that bad. And in fact, when I tried to calculate versus historical norms, like the positional value gained or lost by teams, most teams were in the positive because they had prioritized positions that were typically, they were taking them earlier, I guess, and in larger volume in the first round, the tier one type of value positions. Do we give any credit for that? That maybe at least it's moving a little bit less outside of these very loud examples that we see of the running backs going early.
I mean, I would give them more credit if they weren't letting Levis fall all the way through the first round. Like, it just shows I think once again, we're falling into the trap of saying teams have gotten sharper when I just think their evaluations lined up with what we think is correct. They are not looking at this in a way that holistically we would say is sharp. It's very individual at a team level where the consensus, their board, their scouts, and them all decided, no, actually this guy should go here. And it happened to line up with our idea of positional value in general through the first round.
No, I agree with you. I agree with you on the quarterback thing with Levis. I think that's the clinching that we're talking about here, is that irrationally, and this is maybe like a fan, media, ownership then gets put down on the GM. Again, I'm cutting them excuses, which I know you hate. Like, there's just something different about a quarterback pick. I mean, I saw, like, for instance, when I'm putting out, and you're very much in the camp. I mean, you're out in front of me by a long stretch when it comes to, like, everyone drafts quarterbacks all the time. But when I've been out there, you just get all of these complaints, you get all these objections that are presumed to be true, but are not really based in evidence when it comes to quarterback picks. And one of them that I've heard, and this is what I think prevents teams from taking a quarterback, is if you draft a quarterback early and you miss, you're done. Like, you've blown up the franchise. You have to do a franchise reset. And I'm just shocked that I've seen that said as if it's a fact a lot of times because of all of the weight that's put on those picks. Yet we look at recently, we say Tampa Bay still has the same GM that drafted Jameis Winston, and then they end up, going on to win with Tom Brady. The Rams still have the same GM that drafted Jared Goff, and they go on to win with Matthew Stafford. The Jets GM now is on Aaron Rodgers after having blown a pick on Zach Wilson. And even before that was Sam Darnold, but it wasn't the same GM. So there are just lots of examples of teams that have done pretty well.
Well, don't forget the canonical example of Howie Roseman.
Exactly, Howie Roseman, another great example. Like, there's all these teams that are actually doing pretty well. They're actually near the top, that have used a very high valuable pick on a quarterback. So, like, that's not even a fact. I just think people just on the inside need to be able to look at a first round pick for a quarterback. For instance, the Titans, right, who didn't take Levis at 11, and then we're able to go and get him in the second round. But at the same point in time, they took Peter Skoronski in the first round, who's a tackle who may end up actually being a guard in the NFL. Like, what are we doing here? Like that they've had multiple first round picks who are going to be almost zeros. They have one who literally was a zero a couple of years ago for the Titans, and another quarterback who may end up being a zero, basically a zero. Like, people blow first round picks all the time. I don't know why the quarterback pick can't be treated in the same way. I think it's part of that clinching. It's part of the same thing of my job is in danger, despite the fact that the evidence may not back that up.
Yeah, exactly right. But I think that, and this kind of dovetails with my original take about Howie, where I think he's still he's smart, he's the best, but there's so much room, because what is the lesson he should have taken from the whole thing with Wentz and then Hurts?
Not to tie yourself into Jalen Hurts forever, which is kind of what they did with this contract.
I don't mind the contract so much as I dislike them not taking another shot at QB. And
the contract's tough to get out of. The contract, if you look at how it's structured, it's insane. Like, it has like $100 million in dead cap at the end of the thing in a void year because it's just pushing further. It'll just be much harder to get out of than the Wentz contract, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that goes to what I think the actual lesson that Howie took from the Wentz deal is that I can get out of anything. I can trade my way out of any problem, because I'm that much better than the rest of the league. And I think that smugness and overconfidence is going to come back and bite him in the ass, instead of the humility and the real lesson, which should have been, we just need to keep taking shots at the most important position in football. He said, I am going to double down because I did it right. Again, I'm smart and I can get out of the bad ones and I can lock in the good ones, and I'm right this time. And I think that that is exploitable.
Yeah, I'm definitely down on the Jalen Hurts contract. You know, I was like the draft Jalen Hurts guy, and I was pretty positive on him. I do think getting out of it can be a little bit harder as a former second round pick, as opposed to Carson Wentz, who a lot of people, probably roughly half the NFL, had him as being the top quarterback in 2016. So I think there was like still some percolating sentiment around him being, you know, worthy of taking a shot on, where I don't know if that'll transfer to Hurts. And, you know, Hurts has AJ Brown, he has Devontae Smith, he has Dallas Goedert, he has one of the best offensive lines. He runs the ball a lot, which will maintain probably for at least another 5 years or so, but I don't know much beyond that. So yeah, I think I agree there that we might be at peak Howie right now. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Yeah, I really feel like if you look at what he's done in the draft, like one of the other things he does is he'll find a guy he really likes and he'll trade up for him, not a quarterback, right? He betrays a lot of overconfidence in evals. And I don't think, and again, you judge a guy on what he does, right? Just what he does. That's the heuristic. And so he's number one for me. But I just think that there's a lot of other stuff in his profile that shows that maybe he's not thinking as clearly about and appreciating, right, the uncertainty and the base rates as much as he should. But at the end of the day, I think they're doing so much right, and the edges they have are so large that it's unless and until a real analytics GM gets up and gets a chance, that no one's really going to be able to take them down. So no, I don't know this is peak Howie, because I think the rest of the league is just so bad at this.
Okay, well, I don't know if you have a strong opinion on this or not, but this, again, when it comes to Howie, and I think he's probably pushing heavier on this void year usage. The Browns are doing it to a certain degree. This is another, like, I have lots of ideas for things to write up that I'm too lazy to do, but I think I will actually do this one also. I think it's interesting that this is where the NFL is going in large degree, because you have ownership that's willing to pay a lot of cash up front, which then can benefit you in like the time value of money. Like there's no inflation rate in the end. Well, I'll say this, the cap goes up by a significant inflation rate, but the money that you're giving out in cash today can be put out into future years. And again, with this Hurts contract, he has multiple bonuses, which they're going to string 5 years out. And then there's going to be another bonus. They're going to string 5 more years out and another bonus. And
Sure.
You're essentially doing is saying, we're going to give you 50 million today, but which would be, you know, whatever percent of the cap today, 2% of the cap today, but it's only going to end up being 1.5% of the cap in the actual years where we're going to charge it off onto the cap. Is there any danger that we're going too far in this direction? I wonder a little bit there, because again, it might hurt some flexibility in the future.
I think the only real risk is, and I think it's small, but it's definitely there, is the same kind of risk that all these bankers at these mid-sized banks made in putting all their money into these bonds and then having interest rates go up a huge amount, and then you're stuck with it. So in other words, if the appreciation or the cap doesn't keep going up at 10% a year or whatever it's been going up, if that stops, if it dips back down again in a way that you don't think it's going to continue to rise in the future, like remember we had that one year during COVID where it actually went down quite a bit, but it didn't change anyone's actions because their expectations for the future was it was just going to continue to go up again. So they didn't really have to change their ways. But if that were to change, then I think structures like what Howie's doing can come back to bite you. I just think it's probably such a small probability you don't really need to worry about it. But one place where I do disagree with you pretty strenuously, and with Jason at Over the Cap, is that Jordan Love bet against himself, right? Like, okay, so yeah.
You want to dig into that? We can dig into that.
Yeah. Because so here is the take, right? That he's somehow unworthy as an athlete, right? Because he hedged. Right, because he took certainty instead of a marginally higher payoff. Well, I dispute both of those propositions. I think, first of all, taking certainty when you don't have full control over all the little pieces that are going to help you be successful or not, especially on the field. Like his wide receiver core is dog shit. They're probably bottom 6 in the league. The surrounding cast is just
Christian
not
Watson
good.
had a breakout year last year, but yeah, go ahead.
Dobbs, yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Well, let me just back up for 1 second. For those
let me finish. Let me just finish,
okay,
and I'll wrap this up. And then I'll say, and then the other part of this is that that he somehow is going to make less because of this. Well, it's only marginally less than the 5th-year option. Now it's guaranteed, and he doesn't have to worry about it. And he has guaranteed himself 2 shots. If he crushes this year, he'll get paid. If he's bad this year and he crushes next year, he'll get paid. If he crushes this year and doesn't crush next year, he'll still get paid. He has 2 bites at the apple. This was sharp. This was very sharp by Jordan Love. It was sharp for both sides.
Okay, let me just get the details here. So we know exactly what's going on. For those who are unaware. So Jordan Love, entering the 4th year of his contract, the Packers would have had to make a decision on to whether or not to pick up his 5th-year option. So the 5th-year option for Love, who doesn't hit any of, it's a gradation depending upon whether you hit playing time, whether you've made it to a Pro Bowl, multiple Pro Bowls, how much you can make on this 5th-year option. It actually gets pretty steep for a while. He's got nothing so far in his career for Jordan Love. So I think it'll be a little bit over $20 million. So instead, what he did is he's taking this extension that will guarantee him, I've seen different numbers, either 13.5 or 15.3 million. I think it's more like 13.5 according to the numbers here, over the next 2 years. And then he has a number of incentives that he can get. So I think what the incentives are is a little bit important when looking at this. There's one for $500,000, and I think this is an escalator, so it'll kick into his 2024 salary. It won't be paid off in 2023. So if he had 65% playing time, which seems pretty likely, he ends up getting $500,000. Now, the rest of them are not like that easy to get. So it's $1 million for the Pro Bowl, another $500,000 for the playoffs, another $500,000 for a playoff win, another $1 million for the conference title game, and another $1 million of the Super Bowl. Then you have top 10 in passer rating, top 10 in completion percentage, touchdowns, passing yards, 10 or more games won, go to the playoffs, top 10 in passer rating. And then another one is just like top 16 in a bunch of different categories where you could earn a maximum of a couple $1 million from there. So here's my situation. I have a good, I'll bring up, I have a good a spreadsheet on this one. You'll enjoy this. Because let me make sure I got this one right. Okay, let's put us down here. I gotta change this thing okay. So I have stinks or good. So this is the 2 different categories for how Jordan Love may play next year. So let's say they were not going to give him the 5th-year option. So they're not going to give 5th-year option, so he would essentially be a free agent. So in that circumstance, I'm going to equate it to being like Daniel Jones a year ago. They didn't pick up his option. He went into his last year. He hadn't done nothing like Jordan Love to this point, but he basically just not been good the entire time, which I'm not sure if that's better or worse than Jordan Love. So I think if Jordan Love had like a Daniel Jones type of season.
I think Daniel Jones is a great comp, by the way.
Okay. So I think if he had like a Daniel Jones type of season, there's some chance he would be in line for a Daniel Jones type of contract after this. So, and I think Daniel Jones, when you look at these incentives that Love has to hit, he barely hit any of these incentives. Like, he doesn't have great volume when it comes to passing. He wasn't a top 10 guy. I think he had a completion percentage that was pretty high because he had an A dot that was like minuscule. So he hit a couple of those incentives, like going to the playoffs, things like that, but not a lot there. And I don't know. Green Bay is looking pretty rough as far as going to the playoffs themselves. So he's earned $10 million. I think this is one important part. He's earned $10 million so far, Love, and he has $3 million that he was set to earn next season, this season, I should say, no matter what, on his contract. So he would have $13 million in the bank. So there's no downside beyond that. So I'm saying if he stinks and he doesn't take this deal, he has his $13 million. I'm saying he can earn $2 million a year for the next couple of years, puttering around, being wherever. And if he's good, though, Daniel Jones in the first year of his contract, which would be after 2023 for Jordan Love, like the equivalent, $46 million in cash. Boom, right off of the bat in that first year, $36 million the next year. So yeah, he would eventually get a contract, Jordan Love, if he's good, even on this deal, but it's going to have built into the contract this lesser amount. So my thing is, for career earnings after, I'm going to say 4 years, I'm not 4 years, but at 3 years into the future, if he stinks, he would earn about 17 million. If he doesn't take this contract, he'll earn 25.5 if he does take it. So yeah, there's a loss there. But if you're good, you're losing out on more than $20 million you could potentially make here. And I don't know. I just think I get it. And maybe you're right. Maybe it's just part of like not being the normal thing for a player to do, to bet on himself. But I just feel the bar is so low for what he has to accomplish in order to have good leverage on the Packers next season. Like they haven't drafted someone else, right? They don't have someone else under contract. I don't know. For me,
and that's another point towards where I don't think these teams are sharp. Look, you just did something smart with the contract with Jordan Love that's good for your team. It gives you optionality through 2 years, right? And what do you do in the draft? You do nothing. You do nothing at the quarterback position. You don't do anything to give yourself outs there. So you're handing Love that leverage. If you're looking at it from management's perspective, if you're looking at it from Love's perspective, no, I absolutely think that 2 shots at the apple with the same set of people in the environment you've grown up in the NFL has value. And having that certainty has value. Knowing where your family is going to be has value. All of those things, and I don't even know if he has a family. These are just, I'm just speaking in general terms. But like all that stuff has value. And I think that also cashing out now, hedging, like something we do as bettors all the time, right? It is absolutely rational. And I think what doesn't have value is the chest puffing and saying that, oh, you didn't bet on yourself. What kind of athlete are you? It just betrays the fact that you don't actually have any confidence in your ability.
Like, I mean, does he think he stinks though? I do think there's a possibility that he isn't that. Well, here's what I'll say too. Well, let me dispute something for a second. Yeah, he has $5.5 million base salary for 2024 in this contract, which is guaranteed, but that's it. So like, if he's really that bad, is that going to be enough for them to, is that going to be the thing that says, okay, we'll make you our 2024 starter, as opposed to if he wouldn't have taken it? Is that really going to be enough?
No, I mean, I think that's why you're still always betting on yourself. That's why I think it's a nonsense kind of argument. Like, he always is going to have to be good to continue to play in this league. Everyone has to play well to continue to get their starting job. So I don't think that like some idea of max effort is not going to occur because he took this.
No, I think max effort is going to occur. I think it's just
there
weird.
There are lots of things about his situation that are going to be a drag on his production, right?
Yeah.
And so it's going to be about how much the team, right, looks at that and weights it all and says, no, here's where we think you did good and we can build with you, and here's where we think you need to improve, and that will be part of their decision making in the next year. But I think it betrays a lot of how they think about this, that they didn't pick up another QB.
I guess, or they just could be dummies, as you've said. Well, they don't have a lot of cap space for next year, so that might be part. I mean, Geno Smith got a big contract. I mean, Jesus Christ, they're just hanging out. They're just handing out money at these different places. Okay, whatever. We can agree to disagree. I agree that it's marginal, but for me, if you're already like assured to have $13 million versus getting a little bit more extra guarantee, whatever. He's got first round pedigree. I'm sure he would be able to potentially catch on somewhere else.
The Giants should have done this with Daniel Jones. They absolutely should have done this.
Well, maybe they offered it to him. Maybe Daniel Jones has some confidence in himself, like a real man, Okay, so
there we go.
All right, so let's just think positively. Okay, well, actually, let's think about some other teams here. What about your Ravens? Are you allowed to speak at liberty for what you're seeing from your Ravens? Because I think they played the Lamar Jackson contract situation well. As far as giving him the non-exclusive tag, they got it done. I think that was okay. They in this draft though only had 5 picks. They traded back into the 7th round, which is kind of a weird one, to get an extra pick. But this is the first draft we've seen from them in a while of not having compensatory picks. I haven't seen the Browns with a lot of compensatory picks or any because they've been spending a bunch of money. The Eagles, again, when they're adding on all these void years, I guess we'll find out what the legality of compensatory picks is with void years, but I believe it kind of disqualifies you from compensatory picks because you're releasing a player technically on that void year versus whatever else is going on. What do you think about that? I think that's an interesting angle. Again, when we're talking about this like can kicking sort of playing for now a lot in the NFL is a little bit of a less focus on these compensatory picks and maybe how the Ravens are even playing away from that game when they're a team that's averaged like 3-4 compensatory picks a year for about a decade.
I think the NFL with their attorneys and the capologists, I think there's a lot of competition to find small edges in the way that they creatively contort themselves underneath the cap. I think that void years are something that have been used, and I think there's small edges without getting into too much detail because I just don't think it would be useful for anyone. But like it would be boring and it would give away certain things. But I think that there are small, tiny edges to be had with void years still. But it's like you're talking about pennies when you can pick up dollars. I mean, we're coming back to this whole idea of like, why are we even talking about GMs and teams and how they need to get better when it's this, if you're still messing up the draft in the easy ways, right? And yet you're absolutely crushing, right? Salary cap stuff, right? But then you just blow it all away because you mess up the easy stuff in the draft or in other ways that you evaluate players. I just think it's kind of a nonsense discussion. I think that it all kind of gets washed out. But yeah, no, I think that there's interesting things happening with the cap. I don't think it's rocket surgery. I think that people overcomplicate the cap. I think people, when they talk about cap as a myth, I think that's nonsense. Every single dollar is spent hits cap. It hits the cap, guys. So it's just about how creative you get and how you amortize it. It's where you push those dollars. And like you said, sometimes there's some sharp things to be done because the cap will, go up, and then you have a dollar actually being worth less in terms of cap value. But a lot of these teams are actually operating under cash flow constraints. So I think there's other things, and I don't really enjoy the cap talk as much as some. I'm one of those who believe that we should abolish the cap. I really do. I think that you would have much more interesting team building. Like you could actually have a super team of defensive stars against Pat Mahomes. And because of the stacked talent on that team that I'm imagining in my head, I think they could win. I think you could have a situation where these old school tropes about how football should be played and won could actually come to pass again. So those are my cap takes.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've had that discussion before on the abolishing the cap. I guess anything's possible. Anything is possible. Okay, one other guy that I want to mention here because I'm struggling here to find anyone that you might enjoy. I want to talk about your.
And I will say this about the Ravens.
Yeah.
Once again, not a sharp draft. Like their second pick, I think 3rd round, they took another linebacker. This goes back to this whole point about, so they were sharp about how they structured the Roquan deal last year. If they let him walk and they got that comp pick, right? Mm-hmm. So back to your whole argument, but they didn't. They kept him, and that betrays within that building the idea that they liked the player. They had an evaluation that they were going by, rather than some broader idea of how to run an organization that maximizes value over the long term. This was, they like a guy and they got their guy, and now they're keeping their guy. That's it. This is not, there's no 3D chess here. And then they took another one because now their 1st round pick, a queen, blew up and no one in the building likes him or something. I don't know. I'm spitballing. I don't know anything. But like, so now they have to get this. But now they'll say, well, it's a 3rd round pick. It's still fairly premium from my perspective, like 4th and on for those kind of non-premium positions, please. And so I just, once again, I think that they're just kind of okay. They're just kind of okay when it comes to the draft.
Okay. What about, I'm looking, I just pulled up some GM power rankings, and yeah, it's rough out here in these streets because Like number 2, okay, is Brett Veach for the Kansas City Chiefs. I mean, that's fine. It's whatever, results based sort of thing.
Yeah.
Going a bit further though, number 5, John Lynch, Kyle Shanahan for the San Francisco 49ers. Any opinions on what they got going on over there?
I mean, he's a puppet, right? Does he actually make decisions?
I don't know. I want to know because the kicker pick. I thought that was interesting. Do you have a kicker take? Do you have a kicker / punter draft tape? Because I think we had the Patriots drafting multiple specialists, and then we had the 49ers drafting a kicker who they were assured that other teams were interested in and were going to get up and go get him if they didn't get him.
Here's the I think this is like the quintessential question. Knowing what you know, okay, about the Baltimore kicker, where would you select him? What round?
Knowing what I know,
knowing that he's surefire Hall of Famer, one of the best to ever do it.
You would draft him first year? I don't know.
Where
it might
I'm
be the
asking
first round.
you, where
I might
would you
draft him in the
draft
first round. I might draft him in the first round.
So yeah, there's no chance. There's no chance.
It's close. I mean, it's close. It's pretty good. I mean, if you knew he was going to do that, I think that's a big problem, though.
I would avoid him like the plague, especially if I knew he was going to be good, because that gives you all the wrong incentives as a team. Now you don't have to re-sign. Now you think you're good on special teams and you're going to rely on it, and that's absolutely what you don't want.
I don't know. I'd have to look at that to see how much it actually affects teams' decision making. Because if we're talking about just your run-of-the-mill kicks that you have to take, getting that marginal benefit seems pretty good. Like even if you made all the optimal decisions, how many points do you think you could get extra from Tucker versus another kicker in a season? I don't know, like 15 points or something like that, maybe? I don't know.
I think he's very good, but
like half
I think
a win.
the costs of having a very good kicker inside of an organization are higher than we want to believe.
Okay. How about with the quarterback thing again? Because I want to go get your temperature on this, because this is something that we discussed before, which was one of your blasphemous takes from last time.
Wait, which one? There's so many.
I think it was it was who like is you would not look to draft a high quarterback to bring in competition versus which quarterbacks. And I think at that point in time, a year ago, roughly, or a little bit longer, a little bit shorter than a year ago, it was Mahomes, Allen, Herbert. I don't remember if Jackson was in there.
I don't know if Burrow was in there, but he might.
Burrow was a maybe, I think. Burrow was a maybe.
I wouldn't have been a maybe on Burrow and a yes on Herbert. I don't think.
You don't think?
But maybe I was. Maybe I was.
I don't know. Herbert was probably, a little bit further up there, having been Rookie of the Year and had probably a better year going in there. So let's say, are we shoving Burrow into there? And then outside of that, is there anyone else that we're looking at that could qualify, or are we still saying like Will Levis again should have been looked at by all of these different teams that we're talking about here?
Yeah, the latter. Yep. I mean, it's just very simple, and here's something I want your take on.
Yeah.
I think so much of the conversation, especially on Twitter and stuff like that, for people who are kind of like analytics adjacent, who they're like open to evidence-based stuff, but they're just so tired of the same old stuff. Like they get bored, right? Mm-hmm. Why would you ever get bored with something that's correct? Like, I understand hearing about fourth downs can get tedious. I don't really talk about it anymore. But I still believe that it's absolutely the correct thing to do most of the time, to go for it and be aggressive. But what do you think about this emotional reaction when really what we prioritize is the novel, not the correct? And I just think it's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit disingenuous, like this idea of I don't want to hear it anymore because I've heard it before and we all get it. Because those same people who say that, if you also say, well, Bijan Robinson shouldn't be taken anywhere in the first round, they'll tell you you're insane for saying that. So it's not just we've said it so much, they even still disagree. I don't think there's a lot of people who wholeheartedly agree with the positional value thing that are also saying they're tired of hearing it. I think they're just tired of hearing it, partially because they're like, we get it, and partially because they actually don't agree. And I'm with you. Like, talk about fourth downs as much because teams have gotten a lot of the really, really easy edge off of that. There's still some places to go. The teams have been a lot better at that. We don't talk as much about second running back contracts. I'm probably more forgiving than you and others are. Obviously, they're like Derrick Henry, if you're paying him $13 million a year, like it's not great, but it's a little bit more than the franchise. It's like a franchise tag sort of thing at that situation. It's not as bad. It's not like the Zeke contract, which really locked the Cowboys in. So the NFL has come our way. It's just the NFL hasn't come our way here. So that's why we're still talking about it a lot.
Yeah. And it's interesting that we completely. So now that the NFL has come around to running backs being of a lower value because of all the reasons we've always discussed for years and years and years. I mean, I still think that I don't think that second contract value has caught up with the actual value of. I think they still might be overvalued, and I think that that's the interesting conversation we can have once this idea has become institutionalized of positional value, and it's reflected in second contracts in a way that is better commensurate with what we think actual value is. Then you can start talking about, well, where do we go next, right? Now we can have these more interesting conversations that have all this nuance, that are a little less firmly grounded in the evidence, and you can be a little more creative. But right now it's just so easy. You just point to these things and you're doing it wrong. And I'm going to keep saying it. I think we need to keep saying it. And God bless you. I think you've been doing probably lifting the heaviest lift of anyone this draft season, just talking about this, that base rates really do matter. I think Cade gave you some shout outs, and I think it's just much needed. We just need to reestablish the baseline of why we even do what we do. And that's that we want to give solid reasons for why you should make certain decisions in the NFL. And the fact that they still aren't being done is I don't want to say disheartening. It just, I guess what I would say is, I no longer make bets on GMs being smart. I bet on them being dumb.
Yeah. I mean, that's fair. I just think that the last thing that people are doing, and maybe this is one of the things that unnerves me a little bit more, is whether it's GMs or whether it's like a lot of media people, is that when it comes to, let's say, the draft, right? Fundamentally, you're making predictions. This is like explicitly what you're doing. I think people are making predictions with a lot of different things that they're doing, at least implicitly, but this is like an explicit predictions. Yet people are still spending no time figuring out what is the best prediction, right? What's the best way to make a prediction? And you talk about base rates, other ways of doing it versus their own individual opinions on that. And I mean, maybe it just doesn't sell is part of it. And I think that's, like, it doesn't sell as a media thing, and maybe it doesn't sell to ownership for GMs to say that this is the approach we're taking versus I'm going to have some magic scouting dust and sprinkle it all over our draft board, and we're going to get the best players, because we all know like that's the most impactful thing is actually drafting the right players, but it's also something we can't control, and it's putting those two things together.
But those things are connected. The fact that the media doesn't repeat these things to the extent that they should be repeated, that they don't put them forward as the correct way to do things, to the extent that there is evidence to suggest that they are correct, that ownership doesn't read that they're correct. Like, one of the most interesting things I ever heard in talking to some folks in baseball was that it wasn't Moneyball that changed owners' minds. Okay. It was the movie, right? They had to see it on the big screen. The owners had to see it on the big screen. They had to feel viscerally, I don't want to be an idiot anymore. I want to be one of those smart guys. And we haven't had that moment in the NFL. We just haven't yet.
Yeah, we haven't. And the monetary incentives for being sharp are not as much there, since everyone's just counting their checks basically as far as what they're doing. I mean, I've been watching a lot of like international soccer recently, and that's really is kind of an interesting thing, because you have not only like very much a two-tier system within all these different leagues, but then you have the fear of relegation. If you put the fear of relegation in some of these guys' hearts, I think it would make things a little bit more interesting. Or who knows, maybe they would start making even worse decisions because they would be reacting to what happened the day before. I mean, famously in soccer, they like fire the manager every other week when things aren't going well. There's certain teams have had 3 or 4, coaches or managers over the season, just in some hope that it'll spark something.
Amazing. Yeah, I've been following F1, and that's another kind of like princely endeavor for these billionaires. And the thing about it is, it's just so much more determinative. Like, it's so like Red Bull is good this year. Like, they know something no one else does, and they're winning every single time. And that's interesting to me. That when your edge is so good, it's something that you can continue to exploit week after week, race after race. That's something we don't have in the NFL either.
Yeah, F1, better known as the NASCAR for the bourgeois subset, the wine sipping bourgeois like yourself.
There's more interesting turns in braking. Yeah.
You don't appreciate the circular nature of you can go and chug a beer, go to the bathroom, and come back, and it's like nothing's happened.
Right, exactly. No, you just wait for the crash. That's all they do.
Pretty much it. All right, Josh, he said it all. He did it all. Follow Josh on Twitter at Frisco Josh. Good season coming up here. I'll have you on again. Maybe we'll do some predictions. Maybe we'll do some predictions for the season. I don't remember what our predictions was last time. We gotta like did we have some predictions for last season?
Yeah, they were fun. Remember we did the recap show.
Oh yeah, we did the recap on that. Okay. Yeah. So my predictions have been not so hot, but we'll see what ends up happening here. Anyway, my friend, thank you so much for the time, and I'll be talking to everyone next week. Thanks.